Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going way back in time to ancient Greece
Right.
to explore one of the most well-known and fascinating goddesses,
Yeah.
Aphrodite. You gave us quite a few sources this time around, even that
Yeah.
Wikipedia article,
Oh, classic.
classic Wikipedia, but we want to go beyond the basics on this one.
Yeah, we really want to uncover, I think, the kind of unexpected depths
Okay.
to Aphrodite. So not just the love and beauty, the surface level stuff,
Right.
but really like look at the myths and how she evolved over time,
Okay.
and what that says about the ancient world and even about us.
Yeah, I love that. And just to kick things off, the name Aphrodite itself, it's already kind of a puzzle.
Oh, it really is. I mean, she's like a core Greek goddess,
Right.
but her name likely has Semitic origins. So
Yep.
potentially even going back to the ancient Near East,
Mm-hmm.
which already is telling us, how interconnected,
Yeah.
the Mediterranean world was even that far back.
That's already like adding more layers to it than I expected.
Yeah.
Because I always thought of, the name in connection with that whole foam-born myth
Right.
from Hesiod.
Yeah, yeah, that's a classic image.
Yeah.
Aphrodite rising for the sea foam. And Hesiod, kind of cleverly linked her name to the Greek aphros,
Uh-huh.
meaning foam. But scholars today think that was more like folk etymology,
Really?
not a true source.
Wow. So what are the prevailing theories then? Where did she come from?
Well, there's two kind of main lines of thought.
Okay.
The first points to the Near East. We have these strong parallels to goddesses like Inanna
Okay.
and Ishtar,
Mm.
especially in early Greek portrayals of her.
Hmm.
So even scholars who are, a little resistant to like foreign influence ideas
Right.
acknowledge that link.
So she's got this international background right from the start.
Yeah.
What's the second theory?
So the second one is a little more surprising.
Mm-hmm.
There are hints of like an Indo-European dawn goddess influence. It seems unexpected, but these goddesses like the Greek Eos shared some traits with Aphrodite. So
Yeah.
beauty, powerful sexuality,
Oh, okay.
and a tendency for relationships with mortals.
Interesting.
So there are these kind of like threads
Yeah.
that connect them.
So she's this blend, potentially, of all
Yeah.
these different cultural
Absolutely.
threads that's already making her so much more interesting.
Yeah, and I think that's important to remember with deities too, right?
Yeah.
They rarely exist in isolation.
Right.
They evolve, they absorb influences as cultures interact.
Mm.
And Aphrodite is a really prime example of that.
Okay, so we have a goddess with a multi-layered origin story,
Yeah.
but she's not just the love goddess, right?
No, not at all.
There's more to her than that.
Yeah, Aphrodite had this whole array of epithets, revealing different facets of her personality.
Right.
Almost like she had a divine resume,
Mm-hmm.
highlighting different skills
Okay, I relate.
for different situations.
What were some of those contrasting sides?
Okay, so on the one hand, we have Aphrodite Urania,
Okay.
and she represents like the celestial, the higher aspect of love.
Okay.
Think back to Plato's Symposium. This is the Aphrodite that inspires
Yeah.
kind of a more philosophical, almost spiritual love.
Then there's the other side, the more down-to-earth.
Exactly. Aphrodite Pandemos.
Pandemos embodies that love for all the people you know.
Yeah.
It's that kind of universal love. And that aspect of her is very closely associated with persuasion, even seduction.
Oh, okay. So
This is the Aphrodite.
if you needed a little help
Yeah, this is the one you would pray to.
in the romance department, you go to Aphrodite Pandemos.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
For a little help. I like that it makes her seem so much more relatable.
Absolutely.
Knowing that people were looking to her for these very human desires.
Of course, because that's what gods and goddesses are for, right? They
Right.
reflect our own
Our needs and our desires.
needs and desires. Exactly.
Yeah.
But it goes even further than that. We have Aphrodite area, the warlike.
The warlike Aphrodite.
Yeah, it was sometimes even depicted in armor.
Wow.
And then there are these even darker titles like Melanus the Black One
Okay.
and Androphonos, Killer of Men.
Killer of men.
Yeah, hinting at a less pleasant side to the goddess of love.
Wow. So it sounds like she was much more than just hearts and flowers.
Oh, way more.
So how did this multifaceted goddess fit into actual ancient Greek life and worship?
Well, her worship was just as diverse as her personality.
Hmm.
involving festivals,
Okay.
personal rituals, and even connections to societal institutions.
Mhm.
The Aphrodite festival, particularly in Athens, was a major event.
I'm always so fascinated by these ancient festivals. What was the Aphrodisia like?
Okay, so imagine this. The temple is purified with the blood of a sacrificed dove.
Okay.
Statues of Aphrodite are adorned with fragrant oils, and they're carried through the streets for ritual bathing.
Wow.
It was this whole spectacle designed to appeal to all the senses.
That's so vivid.
Yeah.
And didn't she also have a connection to, well, the world's oldest profession?
She did. Aphrodite was seen as a patron goddess of prostitutes.
Oh,
It's important to note that this wasn't, a monolithic category in ancient Greece.
right.
You had the porne, who were often slaves,
Uh-huh.
but also the hetairai, who were educated women who enjoyed a higher social status.
Okay, so that's a really important distinction to make.
It is.
It seems like we bring a lot of modern assumptions to this topic
Right.
that don't necessarily fit with the
Exactly.
historical reality.
Yeah, like that whole notion of sacred prostitution
Yeah.
that some people associate with ancient Greece.
Yeah.
That's largely a myth, a scholarly assumption that's been debunked by more recent research.
Okay.
The reality of prostitution in ancient Greece was far more complex.
So we've got this goddess whose worship was just as layered as she was.
Right.
And whose image might be more complicated than we initially thought.
For sure.
What happened to her as Greek culture spread beyond its own borders? Did Aphrodite change along with it?
She did as Greek culture mixed with others, particularly during the Hellenistic period.
Okay.
Aphrodite blended with powerful goddesses like Hathor and Isis in Egypt.
Makes sense. Isis and Hathor, they were both associated with queenship and magic, right?
Yeah, they were. So those aspects did become
Okay.
a part of Aphrodite's image.
Interesting.
The Egyptian queen Arsinoe II was even seen as Aphrodite's living embodiment during that time.
Wow.
We also see her temples getting even more lavish, grander. Like there was a famous one built on a massive ship, the Tessercontres.
A temple on a ship that's definitely sending a message.
Oh yeah, about power, opulence, all of that.
Exactly.
But then we get to the Romans,
Okay.
and Aphrodite takes on yet another identity, Venus.
Right, Venus, the Roman equivalent. But I remember learning that Venus originally had kind of different associations.
Yeah.
More focused on fertility and springtime.
That's right.
So how did that work out when they merged?
It's so interesting. They formally linked Aphrodite with Venus, bringing in the cult of Venus Erycina from a Sicilian temple of Aphrodite.
Okay.
So over time, Venus, took on a lot of Aphrodite's myths and iconography.
Right.
But Venus's original attributes also influenced how Aphrodite was perceived.
Oh, interesting. So it was a two-way street.
It really was. Yeah, they both kind of changed a bit in the process.
So both goddesses changing. What were some of the lasting impacts of this Roman influence on Aphrodite?
Well, I think one of the most significant was this concept of Venus Genitrix.
Venus genitrix.
Venus as the mother of the Roman people.
Okay.
So this tied her to Roman lineage and national identity in a way that was, very politically useful.
I can see how that would appeal to Roman rulers. Did they make use of that connection?
Oh, absolutely. Leaders like Julius Caesar and Augustus, they claimed descent from Venus
Wow.
through the Trojan hero Aeneas.
So it's all tying back together.
It all ties together. It was this clever way to legitimize their power by linking it back to this powerful, beloved goddess.
So this blending of cultures had a real impact on how Aphrodite was viewed.
Yeah.
And even Roman politics. It's amazing how these ancient myths intertwine with history.
It really is.
But we've got to get to the myths themselves.
Yes.
What are some of the stories that really capture her essence?
Oh, there's so many to choose from.
Mm-hmm.
Each one kind of revealing a different facet of her. But let's start with her birth from the sea foam.
Okay.
That iconic image captured in Hesiod's Theogony.
Yeah.
It's such a violent and beautiful story.
Yeah.
Cronus castrates his father Uranus, and from the resulting sea foam, Aphrodite emerges.
There's something so primal about that imagery.
It really is. And remember, this story might have even been inspired by a Hittite myth
Oh, wow.
about the god Kumarbi.
Okay.
So again, more of those cultural connections.
Right, so even her origin story has these international roots.
Yeah.
But what about her love life? We can't talk about Aphrodite without talking about her relationships,
Right.
which were complicated to say the least.
That's putting it mildly.
Her marriage to Hephaestus, the god of the forge.
Yes.
It's almost a case of divine irony.
It really is. I mean, he was known for his skill, but not exactly for his looks.
Right.
Well, Aphrodite was the embodiment of beauty and desire.
So no surprise that she wasn't exactly the faithful type.
Not at all. Her affairs were legendary,
Mhm.
often causing amusement and gossip among the other gods.
It's like a divine soap opera
It really is.
playing out on Mount Olympus.
Yeah, and one of the most famous stories, of course, involves Ares, the god of war.
Yeah.
Remember how Hephaestus caught them in a rather compromising position?
Oh, yeah, he set a trap for them. It's such a classic myth.
It is.
What are the details again?
Okay, so Hephaestus, being the skilled craftsman that he was, he made this incredibly fine net almost invisible,
Okay.
and he rigged it above his bed.
Oh.
And when Ares and Aphrodite snuck in for a private moment,
They were caught.
they were ensnared for all the gods to see.
Talk about embarrassing.
It was very awkward. And remember, even Poseidon, the god of the sea, got involved, convincing Hephaestus to release Ares, probably with a hefty bribe.
Wow, so even the gods had each other's backs.
Yeah, there was a sense of solidarity when it came to matters of the heart.
Okay, so we've got the passionate affair with Ares, but what about Adonis?
Ah, Adonis.
That story always felt different,
Yeah, it does.
more tragic and emotionally intense.
It's definitely a story that deserves our attention.
Yeah.
Adonis was a mortal of exceptional beauty.
Right.
So much so that both Aphrodite and Persephone, queen of the underworld,
Wow.
wanted him for themselves.
That's quite the love triangle.
It really is.
How did they resolve that?
Well, Zeus, ever the mediator, decreed that Adonis would spend a third of the year with each goddess
Okay.
and the remaining third wherever he chose.
So he had some say in the matter.
He did. And of course, Adonis, captivated by Aphrodite, chose to spend his free time with her.
But it couldn't have ended happily ever after, could it?
Sadly, no. While hunting, Adonis was fatally wounded by a wild boar. Some say Ares sent the boar out of jealousy. Others blame Artemis, the goddess of the hunt, seeking revenge for another transgression.
Okay.
Either way, Aphrodite was devastated.
I can imagine.
Her tears, as they fell, transformed into anemones.
That's so poetic, and that explains why the anemone is associated with her.
Exactly.
It also ties into the Adonia festival, right?
It does. During the Adonia, women would plant these gardens of Adonis.
Gardens of Adonis.
Yeah, little containers with quick-growing herbs that would soon wither, mirroring that fleeting nature of Adonis's life.
Wow.
It was a powerful ritual, a way for women to connect with the cycles of life, death, and rebirth.
So these myths, they weren't just stories. They were a way for people to process their own experiences, emotions, things.
Yeah.
Speaking of emotions, we've talked about Aphrodite's love and her sorrow, but didn't she also have a vengeful side?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's important to remember that ancient deities weren't always benevolent. They had their darker sides, and Aphrodite was no exception.
Yeah.
Crossing her could have dire consequences.
So what are some examples of Aphrodite's wrath?
Well, there's this story of the women of Lemnos who neglected to make sacrifices to Aphrodite.
Oh.
And as punishment, she cursed them with this terrible odor, making them repulsive to their husbands.
Wow.
The consequences were tragic, culminating in a massacre.
Yikes. That's a stark reminder that she wasn't a goddess to be trifled with.
No, she wasn't.
Any other examples?
Another chilling tale is that of Hippolytus, who spurned Aphrodite's advances, choosing to honor Artemis instead.
Okay.
And in a jealous rage, Aphrodite made Hippolytus's stepmother, Phaedra, fall madly in love with him.
Oh, that just sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It was Hippolytus rejected Phaedra, leading her to accuse him falsely of assault before taking her own life.
Oh, no.
And this set in motion a series of events that resulted in Hippolytus's gruesome death, a truly brutal display of Aphrodite's power.
Those are definitely stories that stick with you.
Yeah.
It's a side of Aphrodite we don't often hear about, but it makes her a much more complex and compelling figure. But we can't wrap up this deep dive without mentioning the Judgment of Paris, right?
Of course not.
That myth is so central to Western literature and art.
It really is. It's a story that perfectly encapsulates the power of beauty, the capricious nature of fate, and how seemingly small choices can have monumental consequences.
So remind us, how did this fateful judgment lead to the Trojan War?
It all started with a wedding.
Okay.
And Eris, the goddess of discord, well, she wasn't invited.
Oh, no.
And she decided to stir up some trouble.
Classic Eris.
She tossed a golden apple inscribed for the fairest into the party.
And that's where it all began?
That's where it all began. Hera, Athena, and of course, Aphrodite all claimed the apple.
Of course.
Leading to this divine beauty contest.
Okay.
Zeus wanting no part in this appointed Paris, a Trojan prince as the judge.
And that's where Aphrodite's powers of persuasion come in.
Right.
What were the bribes? What were these goddesses offering?
So Hera promised power. Athena offered wisdom. But Aphrodite went straight for the heartstrings.
Right.
She promised Paris the most beautiful woman in the world as his wife.
And we all know who that was.
Helen of Sparta, already married to King Menelaus.
Right.
Paris, swayed by Aphrodite's promise, chose her. And that's what sparked the Trojan War.
Wow.
It's a stark reminder that, even the gods weren't immune to desire, and that seemingly small choices can have earth-shattering consequences.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, what if Paris had chosen differently? Would history have taken a totally different path?
Right.
Fascinating. But let's shift gears a bit. We've talked about Aphrodite's myths and her worship, but how is she visually represented?
Yeah.
What can we learn from, her depictions in art throughout history?
That's a great question. The way Aphrodite was portrayed in art, it's like this window into how different cultures perceived her, from ancient Greece to the modern era.
Okay.
In ancient Greek art, we see this fascinating contrast in her representations.
What are some examples of those different portrayals?
We'll take the Ludovisi throne, this beautiful relief sculpture from the 5th century BC.
Okay.
It shows Aphrodite rising from the sea, her wet clothes clinging to her body, a symbol of both her sensuality and her divine power.
So that image of Venus on the half shell goes all the way back to ancient Greece.
It does.
Wow.
But then we have the Aphrodite of Knidos, sculpted by Praxiteles in the 4th century BC.
Okay.
Now, this was groundbreaking. This was the first full-sized nude statue of a goddess.
Wow.
It caused a sensation, and it really changed the way Aphrodite was depicted from then on.
It's amazing how one statue can have such a lasting impact. It makes you think about the model for that statue, a real woman who dared to challenge societal norms.
Right.
There's even a story about Apelles, a famous Greek painter.
Yeah.
It said that he was inspired to create his Aphrodite Anadyomene, depicting her rising from the sea after seeing the courtesan Phryne bathe naked at a festival.
Oh, wow.
That's quite the story.
It is.
Sounds like something straight out of a myth itself. So how did Aphrodite's image evolve as we move into later periods, like the Renaissance?
Well, that birth from the foe motif remained incredibly popular.
Okay.
Think of Botticelli's famous Birth of Venus.
Right.
That ethereal image is directly inspired by those ancient Greek portrayals.
Yeah.
Titian also depicted her emerging from the water in his Venus Anadyomene.
Right, but Titian's Venus of Urbino, even though it's named for the goddess, it seems different.
Yeah.
It lacks those obvious symbols.
It does.
And it feels more intimate, more focused on her beauty as a woman, not necessarily a goddess.
That's a keen observation. Renaissance artists were reinterpreting these classical themes, bringing their own perspectives and a touch of humanism to these divine figures.
It's like we're seeing Aphrodite through new eyes, each era adding its own interpretation.
Exactly.
Did this trend continue into the 19th century?
Absolutely. Venus paintings were all the rage in the 19th century. David's Mars, being disarmed by Venus, is a great example, blending classical and contemporary styles. And then there's Cabanel's Birth of Venus, which was a sensation, but also sparked criticism for being too idealized.
And of course, we can't forget Manet's Olympia,
Right.
a painting that directly challenged those traditional idealized depictions of the female nude. It's always felt like such a statement about, the male gaze and the way women were portrayed in art.
You hit the nail on the head. Olympia was controversial, but it forced people to confront the complexities of representation and the power dynamics inherent in art.
It's interesting how these seemingly simple depictions of beauty can open up these larger conversations about society and culture.
For sure.
But we've talked about art. What about Aphrodite's presence in literature?
She's been a source of inspiration for writers throughout history. Shakespeare's Venus and Adonis, which retells the classic myth, was a bestseller in its time.
Wow.
It shows how those ancient stories still captivated audiences centuries later.
It's amazing how those myths endure, but literary tastes change, right?
They do.
I read that Venus and Adonis wasn't always so popular with the later critics.
That's true. It's a reminder that even classics are subject to reinterpretation and changing values.
Right.
But it also makes you wonder, what will future generations think of the books we consider classics today?
That's a fascinating question.
Yeah.
It speaks to how literature is always in dialogue with the times. What other literary trends involving Aphrodite stand out to you?
Well, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, we see this surge of stories about statues of Aphrodite coming to light.
Oh, I remember reading a few of those. What do you think that fascination with living statues was about?
Well, it's thought to be linked to the anxieties and changing roles of women in society at that time. The idea of a statue, traditionally passive and objectified, suddenly coming to life and gaining agency must have been both alluring and unsettling.
It's like those stories were grappling with the changing dynamics between men and women using these ancient myths as a framework.
Yeah.
Didn't some feminist writers also engage with Aphrodite's story in interesting ways?
They did. Poets like Amy Lowell used the myth of Aphrodite's birth to explore themes of female empowerment and creative expression.
Okay.
It's a powerful reminder that these ancient myths can be reinterpreted and made relevant to contemporary concerns.
So after this deep dive into Aphrodite, what have we learned? What makes her story so compelling even today?
Well, I think it's her multifaceted nature.
Hmm.
She embodies love and beauty, but also rage and vengeance.
Right.
She's both divine and deeply human, capable of great love and terrible wrath.
It's true.
Her story touches on those universal human experiences, desire, loss, jealousy, the power of beauty, and the consequences of our choices.
It's been such an amazing journey. We've gone from her potential origins in the ancient Near East to her transformations in Roman culture, explored her complex myths, and her enduring presence in art and literature. It's clear that Aphrodite is much more than a simple goddess of love.
And for our listeners, here's a final thought to ponder. Of all the gods and goddesses in the Greek pantheon, why is it that Aphrodite, this goddess of love and beauty, continues to hold such a powerful sway over our imaginations, even after all these centuries?
That's a great question to leave everyone with. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of Aphrodite.
Tell us what you think about this episode. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.